أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. One of the scholars that we're going to be talking about, and this is the last one in the series, is about Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah. And how we're going to do this lecture is I'm going to mention first of all his background, where he came from, who he was, where he was brought up, where he was born, where he died, and just general things about his personal life. And then we're going to talk about what the scholars said about him, what his personality was like, what they said about his character. And also we'll talk about, towards the end, we'll talk about some of the works that he did, some of the books that he wrote, the things that he's known for. So first of all, Imam al-Qurtubi. Who was Imam al-Qurtubi? And what was his real name? And why was he called al-Qurtubi in the first place? His actual name was Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Abi Bakr ibn Farah al-Ansari al-Khazraji al-Andalusi al-Qurtubi. So his actual name was Muhammad ibn Ahmad. That was the name that was given to him when he was born. And his nickname was Abu Abdullah. His nickname was Abu Abdullah. And the scholars of the past, they used to have kunyas. These are called kunyas. So you were named, for example, after your oldest child. And his oldest child, and we'll talk about his children, his oldest child was called Abdullah. And it's not necessarily a condition that a person has to have a child in order for him to have a kunya, to have a nickname. A person cannot have any children, but he can still be given a nickname. For example, Aisha radiallahu anha, she never had any children, but she was also known as Abu Abdullah. And also, with regards to nicknames, it doesn't necessarily have to be a child. For example, Abu Huraira, one of the companions, he was known as the father of the kitten, because he used to always, he used to always have a kitten. So he was known as the father of the kitten. And also, for example, Ali radiallahu anhu, the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam once saw him in the masjid and he was sleeping, and when he turned over, his face, half of his face was covered with dirt. And so he said to him, "Qum ya Aba Turab, Qum ya Aba Turab, stand up, O father of dirt," because he had dirt on his face. And so after that, he was affectionately known as Abu Turab. And with nicknames, there's nothing wrong with having nicknames. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to call Aisha radiallahu anha Aish. So he was like a shortened version of Aisha. But there has to be certain conditions which are met before you give someone a nickname. First of all, the nickname can't be a nickname which has a bad meaning. It can't be a swear word, for example, or someone which is demeaning or humiliating to another individual. And secondly, that nickname can't be something which upsets the person that you're giving it to. If that person doesn't like to be called by a certain name, then you shouldn't be calling him by that name. There's no reason for you to be calling him by a name which he dislikes. So as long as these two conditions are met, there's nothing wrong with people having certain nicknames. So Imam al-Qurtubi, his kunya was Abu Abdullah. And it's mentioned that some called him Shamsuddin. And Shamsuddin means the son of the religion. But it was something which he disliked. He never used to like being called by this name. And this was because of his humility. This is why he's known as al-Qurtubi. SubhanAllah, every time someone says Qurtubi, we all know it's this famous mufassir. When someone says Qurtubi said, Qurtubi rahimahullah, he said, we all know him as Qurtubi. And this is like, it shows his fame and his status in Islam. The fact that you can just say Qurtubi, you can mention the place that he came from, and everyone knows who it is. So Imam al-Qurtubi, it's said that he had two children, he had two sons. One of them was, of course, Abdullah, because he was known as Abu Abdullah. And the other one, it's mentioned that his name was Shihabuddin Ahmad. He had two children, two sons, and these were his two sons. Where did he come from? What was his background? It said that Imam al-Qurtubi was brought up in Qurtuba. He was brought up in the city of Qurtuba. And it said that he had very humble beginnings. He wasn't someone who was very wealthy. His family wasn't a very wealthy family. He was raised and he was educated in Qurtuba. And his father was a farmer. His father was a farmer. And his father died when he was still of a young age. He was, in his early 20s, it said, when his father passed away. And he actually mentions the story of how his father died. His father was actually murdered. And he mentions the story of his father in his book, Tafsir al-Qurtubi. His book of Tafsir, he mentions the story. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ الَّذِينَ قُتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ أَمْوَاتًا بَلْ أَحْيَاءٌ عِنْدَ رَبِّهِمْ يُرْزَقُونَ. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions Surah An-Nisa, don't think that those who die in the path of Allah are dead, rather they are alive with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After this ayah, he mentions the story of his father and what happened to his father. And he said that his father, when they were living in Qurtuba at the time, the Muslim state at the time was in a state of ruin. At that time, there were many different states in Andalusia. So you had different states. Each state was governed by a Muslim ruler. Okay, and this was because of conspirators and non-Muslims trying to cause division amongst the Muslims in Andalusia. And this is a classic a strategy that people use: divide and conquer. They still use it up to today. So you divide the Muslims into different dominions, different kingdoms, and then as a result of that, everyone's just worried about their own kingdom and their own sort of area that they rule over. And as a result, they become weak and they're not united. And this shows us the importance of staying united. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. Hold on to the rope of Allah together and don't differ. So because of this, the Muslims were weak. And there was fighting between the Muslims, and there was also fighting between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. And he said that where he came from in Qurtuba, one day his father was, in the city, and some people came and they killed him. There was like a skirmish, okay? So his father had nothing to do with the fight. He wasn't fighting, he wasn't, in the army, he wasn't a soldier, but he was killed. You could say he was a casualty of war. And so Imam al-Qurtubi, he said, when this happened, the very same thobe that he was wearing, with the very same clothing that he was wearing, that had his blood on it, I would have buried him like that. So this is a story with regards to his father, and he mentions it in this part of the ayah because it's related to those who die as shaheeds. And we can take some benefits from this story. First of all, it shows us that he took religious issues very seriously. The fact that his father died, and he died in this way. His father died in this way when people came and just out of the blue he was killed. Okay, he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't fighting the non-Muslims. They came and they killed him. And he was concerned about what he should do. He went to a few of the mashayikh, went to a few of the scholars of his area. And he asked them, what should he do? What does he do in this situation? And it shows how he used to take these kinds of matters very seriously. And it was something which, he thought was important. Secondly, it shows us that it's something where Imam al-Qurtubi didn't just ask one specific individual. And he went and he asked multiple people. He asked lots of different people. So he used to take knowledge from multiple people, from different people, so that he can make sure he comes to the correct decision and to the correct judgment. So this is what happened with regards to his father. His father died and he was murdered in Qurtuba. And it said that he stayed in Qurtuba after this incident. So that obviously there was instability in the area, in Qurtuba, in Andalusia at the time. The Muslims were weak, there was fighting and civil war taking place, but he still stayed in Qurtuba. And it said that his father died around 627 Hijri. Around 627 Hijri, which is like the early 13th century. So the early 1200s. This is when his father died. And we already mentioned that his father was a farmer and he had a very simple lifestyle. Imam al-Qurtubi wasn't someone who was very wealthy himself. So scholars, they say, and historians, they say that estimating the time that his father died, they gather that Imam al-Qurtubi was quite young. They say he was around 20 or 25 years old when his father died. So he was around that age. And the reason why they don't know exactly when he was born or exactly when he died is because, in the past they never used to put any emphasis on these kinds of things. Rather what was more important is what they used to, their works and what they did in their lives, what kind of books they wrote, what kind of things they did to contribute to Islam. And if you look at books, Islamic books, they do mention sometimes when a scholar died. And the reason why they mention sometimes when a scholar died, and sometimes that can be recorded, is because the person was known. If he was a scholar who was famous, he was a known scholar. And then when he dies, they pray the janazah prayer. And if he's someone who's famous, you have many, many people praying the janazah prayer. So people remember when that individual died, what year he passed away. And so they remember the day that the year and the place and the time that he died, and when exactly he died. But obviously when a person's born, they don't know he's going to be a famous scholar or someone who's righteous. So you don't normally have recordings of exactly when an individual was born, but sometimes you do know when they died. So it said that he was born around 600 to 610 Hijri, roughly around that time, the early 1200s in terms of Islam and Islamic strength. But Qurtuba and Andalusia was far more advanced than other European countries and other European cities at the time. While the other European cities and other European countries which were predominantly Christian, they were living in the Dark Ages. Islam and Andalusia and the Islamic Empire and the Islamic world was flourishing. Okay, and it wasn't the Dark Ages for Islam and for the Muslim states and for the Muslim countries. Imam al-Qurtubi, when he was young, as we mentioned, he had a simple and humble beginning. He used to work and he used to collect clay and he used to collect bricks and he used to take these and sell them to the potters. So he used to sell this to the potters and they used to make pottery from this clay. And this was like something which Qurtuba was known for. It was known for pottery and for making vases and other plates and things like this. Just like, for example, Stoke is today. They're known as potters. The football team is known as potters because they're known to make pottery and other things. So Qurtuba similarly was known for this kind of thing. It was known for a place which was where pottery was made. And we mentioned that the Almohads were the people who had rule over Andalusia at the time. So I want to give you some idea of this place where Imam al-Qurtubi grew up. What kind of place was it? What was his environment? What kind of place did he grow up? Qurtuba was a place, as we mentioned, which was flourishing. It was a place compared to other European countries and other European cities, was way ahead of its time. And from the things that Qurtuba was known for was the fact that they had street lights 300 years before other European countries had them. That's how advanced this place was. It was like the place to be. It was where everyone wanted to go. And it was known for its paved roads. It had hospitals. It had libraries in Qurtuba. And these libraries were, compared to other libraries in Europe, there was no comparison at all. They say that the largest Christian library at the time had 600 books in Europe. The largest Christian library in Europe had 600 books. The library in Qurtuba, the calligraphers, the people who would produce and write the books, they were producing 6,000 books a year. 6,000 books a year. So you can see there's no comparison when it comes to libraries and when it comes to education in Qurtuba. And they also say that on the outskirts of Qurtuba, there were 3,000 villages. Just on the outskirts of Qurtuba. 3,000 villages. So you can just imagine how huge this place was, how huge this city was. There were 3,000 villages outside or on the outskirts of Qurtuba. It said in every single village there was a faqih, there was a scholar. In every single one of those villages. And it said that in the eastern side of Qurtuba, in the eastern districts, on the east of Qurtuba, there when you wanted to study about Islam. So it said that Imam al-Qurtubi, he left Cordoba when he reached around, maybe he said for another 10 years after his father died. So around his 30s, he left Qurtuba and he went and moved to Misr. He moved to Egypt. Because of the instability in Qurtuba and the problems they were having there, he decided to move and he left and went to Egypt. And there were other scholars at the time who actually left Qurtuba as well and they went to Egypt. So he went to Egypt and he studied and he sought knowledge in different places. He went to Alexandria, for example. He went to a place called Mansoura in Egypt. He went to Cairo and he studied in these different places. And when he was in Misr, he went to all these different places and he studied in all these different places, and he eventually died in Misr. He died in Egypt. And he said that he lived in Egypt for about 38 years. So 38 years he lived in the Islamic country of Egypt. And it said that he died in a place called Minya. Minya is a place in Egypt. And it said that he died on a Tuesday on the 9th of Shawwal, 71 wa 600. So the year was 771. That's when he passed away. And later on, or a lot later on, in 1971, it said that they made a masjid where he was buried. And they took the mausoleum that he was buried in and they moved it. From the place where the masjid was built, they moved the mausoleum to another place and they built a masjid where he had been buried. And the masjid is known as Masjid al-Qurtubi, or Masjid al-Qurtubi in honor of Imam al-Qurtubi, rahimahullah. So what I want to do now is talk about some of the characteristics and the personality of Imam al-Qurtubi, and also some stories that talk about Imam al-Qurtubi and things that happened in his life. Imam al-Qurtubi has been described by the scholars as min ibadillahi as-salihin, from the slaves of Allah who was from the righteous, wal ulama al-arifin, and from those righteous scholars of Islam. And he would always be busy with things relating to the akhirah. He would always be investing in the akhirah. That's what he would do with most of his time. And it's been mentioned that he would always complain about the spread of haram, how Islam had spread how haram things and fasad and fitna and trials and tribulations had spread, and how people had left the obligations of Islam. They had left their obligations as Muslims, they had left the salat, they had left other things, subhanAllah. And this was, hundreds of years ago. Imagine if he was alive today and he saw the state of the Muslims. It said that once Imam al-Qurtubi, when he was living in Qurtuba, he lived by a fort that belonged to the non-Muslims. And as we mentioned before, there were lots of skirmishes that would take place. There were lots of skirmishes which would take place between the Muslims and the non-Muslims. The non-Muslims would come, the Christians would come, and they would kill some of the Muslims. And he mentions this very interesting story. He said, they came and they walked straight past me. They walked straight past me. They didn't do anything. And then they turned around and they walked past him again. And they never saw him. Subhanallah. And he said, أَحَدُهُمَا يَقُولُ لِلْآخَرِ. He said, one of them said to the other, هَذَا دِيبَلَ. He said, one of them said to the other, this person is a diablo. In the Spanish language, diablo. Anybody know what diablo is? A devil. They said, this person's a devil. Why did they say that? Because he just disappeared. He just disappeared in thin air. They couldn't see him. So they said, هذا ديبلا. They said, this person is a diablo. He's a devil. وَأَعْمَى اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلْ أَبْصَارُهُم. And he said, Qurtubi said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made them blind and made them so that they couldn't see me in this situation. فَلَمْ يَرَوْنِي. And they couldn't see me. وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ حَمْدًا كَثِيرًا. And I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and I praise Allah. Lots of praises because of this. And subhanAllah, there's many benefits we can take from this. From the benefits is that Imam al-Qurtubi, at this moment in time, you just think about it. For example, if there was a mob outside, okay, and you're going home, and they start attacking you with knives and with sticks, the last thing that will be on your mind is to recite Surah Yasin. You'd be running for your life. Subhanallah. And it takes a person to be, of a certain level of Islam and Iman to compose himself and just start reciting the book of Allah. When he knows that nobody else can help him except Allah Azza wa Jal. And he just started to recite the Quran, recite the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This shows also his composure, how calm and composed he was, how he didn't panic. And there's another story that's mentioned about Imam al-Qurtubi and one of his friends. And his friend was also a scholar known as al-Qarafi. And this took place when he was in Egypt. So he said that we were traveling and we were in a place called Al-Fayoum. Fayoum is a place in Egypt. So he said we approached this place called Fayoum and we had like a ghulam, we had like a servant with us. He said when we entered into the city, we were looking for a place to stay. We were looking for a place to stay while we were there in the city of Fayoum. And so they found a place, and the ghulam, the servant or the guide that they had, he said to them, Billahi la tadkhula. He said to them, don't enter into this place. فَإِنَّهُ مَعْمُورٌ بِالْجَانِ. Because this place is full of shayateen, it's full of jinn. It's a haunted house basically. Don't enter into this place. You don't want to stay here, it's haunted. And so Al-Qarafi said to Imam al-Qurtubi's friend, he said to him, Udkhulu, he said, enter into this place, وَدَعُونَ مِنْ هَذِي الْهَذِيَانِ. Enter into this place and stop talking nonsense basically. These are you're just imagining things, you're just talking rubbish. These are just your hallucinations, you're imagining things, you're making these things up. It's not going to happen. We'll stay the night here. So they went in, and the servant, he stayed behind and he basically prepared the area for them, prepared the place where they're going to stay the night or the few nights that they're going to be living there. And they went to Jami' al-Balad, the place, the main masjid of that area. Okay, so they went there, and it's where they were going to stay the next few nights. The door opened and a goat's head rolled out of the house. And so when Al-Qarafi saw this, he began to scream and he fainted there and then. He fainted there and then. And Al-Qurtubi, what's Qurtubi doing? Qurtubi is standing there, calm and composed. And he stands next to the goat's head. And he picks up the goat's head. He picks up the goat's head and he does isti'adha and basmala. He says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajeem, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. And then he says, Allahu adhina lakum am ala Allahi taftarun. He recites this ayah. Has Allah permitted you to do so, or do you invent something about Allah? He starts reciting this ayah in this situation. And then the servant comes out of the house with a rope and with a knife. And he said that I found this goat, somebody was selling this goat when you were away, and I bought it and I brought it into the house so I could sacrifice it and we could eat it when you guys come back. SubhanAllah. And so then Al-Qarafi, he wakes up. Al-Qarafi, the other scholar, he wakes up and he says to Imam al-Qurtubi, he says, Ya akhi, jazakallahu khairan. He says, my brother, jazakallahu khair, may Allah reward you. He says, if it wasn't for you, I would have lost my mind. SubhanAllah. So this shows you the bravery of Imam al-Qurtubi. It shows you his composure. It shows you how calm and how composed he was in this situation. The fact that there was, you all hear about haunted houses and about places which are spooky and there's things going on and, you shouldn't go there and something's going to happen to you. But even in this situation, Imam al-Qurtubi was someone who was calm, he was composed, he wasn't afraid. And again, just like the previous story we mentioned, he remembers Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He thinks about Allah Azza wa Jal. And subhanAllah, it reminds me of the ayah of Allah Azza wa Jal, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ قَالُوا رَبُّنَ اللَّهِ. Verily those who say our Lord is Allah. ثُمَّ اسْتَقَامُوا. And then they're steadfast on this. تَتَنَزَّلُ عَلَيْهِمُ الْمَلَائِكَةِ. Angels will come down and they will say, أَلَّا تَخَافُوا وَلَا تَحْزَنُوا. They'll say, don't be afraid and don't be sad. You know, when a person is firm on his faith, when he's steadfast, he won't feel this fear. He won't be afraid. He won't be afraid of these kinds of things happening to him. So these are just some of the stories that I mentioned about Imam al-Qurtubi. Also from the things that we can learn about Imam al-Qurtubi is some of the tafsir of some of the ayat he wrote in his book Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions in the Quran, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ وَتُدْلُوا بِهَا إِلَى الْحُكَامِ. He says, don't eat other people's property, don't eat other people's wealth unjustly, and don't give it to the rulers. And Imam al-Qurtubi, he talks about this ayah, and he says that this ayah means that you shouldn't, it's basically talking about corruption, and it's talking about bribery, and you shouldn't give money to the rulers expecting a favor in return. Don't give money to the rulers. And this is what he mentioned, and this is what he said with regards to this ayah. And the scholars who came after him, for example, Ibn Atiyah, he said, وَهَذَا الْقَوْلُ الْأَرْجَحِ. He said, this is the majority opinion, humble, someone who had some type of tawadu, someone who had some type of modesty. Now, with regards to his books and the books that he was known for, the most important book that he wrote was a book known as Al-Jami' li-Ahkam al-Quran lima tadammana min as-Sunnah wa Ayah al-Furqan, and is most famously known as Tafsir al-Qurtubi, the Tafsir of Imam al-Qurtubi. This was the book that he was most famously known for. And many of the scholars have talked about the benefits of this book, Tafsir al-Qurtubi. Ibn Taymiyyah, he was talking about another tafsir, and he said that Tafsir Qurtubi is better than this book by miles. It's much better than this book. وَأَقْرَبُ إِلَى طَرِيقَةِ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ وَالسُّنَّةِ. And it's closer to the way of the people of the Quran and the Sunnah. وَأَبْعَدْ عَنِ الْبِدْعَ. And it's far away from bid'ahs. So he was praising the book of Imam al-Qurtubi, praising the efforts that Imam al-Qurtubi made with regards to this book. And also from the virtues of this book is that when it was written by Imam al-Qurtubi, obviously in those days they never had a printing press. So whenever they would want to reprint a book, if you like, they would have to get someone to write out the whole book. They would have to have someone write out the whole book. And in those days, that was very time consuming. But even though it was time consuming, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, it said it was written 24 copies were made of this book. 24 copies were made of Tafsir al-Qurtubi, which shows you the status of this book, the importance of this book, how people hold this book in very high regard amongst the Muslims. Also, from the benefits of this book is that before he even goes into the tafsir of the Quran, before he even starts to mention the tafsir of Surah Al-Fatiha or Surah Al-Baqarah, he talks about the virtues of the Quran. He talks about the virtues of the Quran, talks about the adab relating to the Quran, how a person should be, those who are learning the Quran, those who are memorizing the Quran, those who are carrying the Quran, what their akhlaq should be like. And he also talks about those people who had memorized the Quran during the time of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ. So he talks about all of these different things before he even starts the tafsir of the Quran, to show people and make people realize and understand the importance and the weight of this book. You know, how important this book is, the virtues and the status of this book in Islam. And he also talked about the conditions he had when he wrote this book. He said that I had two conditions when I wrote this book. إِضَافَةُ الْأَقْوَالِ إِلَىٰ قَائِلِهَا. I would always associate what I said to the person who said it. So if I heard someone say something, I would always mention who it was who said it and what he said. I wouldn't just say something and not tell you where I heard it from and who said it. So he would always mention the person that said that statement that he wrote. And the scholars of the past, they said that min barakatil ilm, from the blessing of knowledge, an yudaf al-qawl ila qailaha. From the blessings of knowledge is to always mention who said that statement. If a person wants blessing in his knowledge and he wants Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, 3 or 4 people, and even after that, he read in a book that he shouldn't have done what he did, which shows us that he was always, researching, always looking, always learning more, always trying to make sure that he's constantly, increasing in knowledge, constantly trying to improve himself as a Muslim. So these are just some of the things that I wanted to mention with regards to Imam al-Qurtubi rahimahullah. And when we mention these types of stories and we mention these types of people, it should be a source of encouragement for us. You think about Imam al-Qurtubi and where he came from. He wasn't someone whose father was an alim, his father was a scholar. That wasn't why he became the person that he was. He came from humble beginnings. He used to collect clay and give it to the potters, and that was his job. That's what he used to do when he was young. So it's a lesson for all of us sitting here today that a person doesn't have to be from a specific family, doesn't have to be in a specific area, in a specific location to be able to learn, to be able to improve himself as a Muslim, to be able to increase in knowledge. If anything, this should encourage us. Many of us, we're working, in factories, might be working in factories, might be working in the shops where we don't want to be working. Meager salaries, places we don't want to be. But that shouldn't stop an individual to go on and excel as Muslims, to go on and learn. But it's all about making that effort. It's all about striving. A person has to make the physical effort himself. He has to strive. You have to make that effort. And that's why the thing that's going to get each and every single one of us into Jannah isn't what we know. It's not what we know. A person can know lots of things about Islam, but it's not what's going to get us into paradise. What's going to get us into paradise is our actions, what we do. And that's where, in the Quran it says, جَزَاءً بِمَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ, a reward for what they used to do. That's what's going to cause a person to enter into Jannah or to enter into hellfire. Not where a person knows. A person might know so many things. He might know lots of things about Islam. It's not going to help him enter into Jannah. And this is why the scholars of the past, they would say, الْعِلْمُ شَجَرَةٌ وَالْعَمَلُ ثَمَرَةٌ. They would say that knowledge is the tree, but the action that a person does, that's the fruit of the tree. Knowledge is the tree, but the actions that you do, that's the fruit of the tree. That's where your knowledge comes into action. That's where you benefit. That's where your good deeds are going to come from. So a person should always be striving to do good deeds. When a person leaves this gathering today, for example, whatever he's learnt, try to implement what you've learnt. Try to act upon what you've learnt. Try to exceed and try to excel as Muslims. We all want to reach that level of ihsan. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَأَحْسِنُوا. He says, strive in excellence. Try your best in everything that you do. Nowadays it's a shame that when it comes to matters of the dunya, we always want to get the best. The top job, make the most money, have the nicest car, have the best house. Always compete with the person who's better than you. If someone's always praying in the masjid, for example, he's always here, every single salah, make it a point that you want to compete with that person. He's always in the masjid, every single salah. I've got to go to the masjid as well. I want to go one day to the masjid, and maybe I might go and he might not be there. And then I can call him and say, where were you? I was at the masjid, I didn't see you. So you always compete with one another in good deeds. Try to compete with one another, because that's ultimately what's going to get you into paradise, what's going to get you into Jannah. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that we strive for those things which are going to benefit us in this life and in the akhirah. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم منه الغفور الرحيم وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
Jazakallah khair for that inspiring lecture. Okay, inshallah, we're going to take some questions. Please keep the questions related to the topic. So if there is anyone that's got any questions, please raise your hands and inshallah we'll take some questions. I think we're limited on time, so we'll take a few questions inshallah and then we'll wrap up. So is there anyone with a question? Okay. Oh, brother here.
You know the masjid that you said that named after Imam al-Qurtubi hasn't got his grave in it, has it?
No, as we said, they moved it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so the mausoleum, they moved his body and then they built the masjid there. Yeah.
One other question is, April Fool's Day got anything to do with Spain?
I've heard I've heard that, but I don't know if there's any truth to that. The fact that April Fool has some link to Spain or to Islamic Spain, or to the fact that the non-Muslims went and they tricked the Muslims, and then they ended up attacking the Muslims, and the Muslims thought that they were okay and they weren't going to be harmed, and then the non-Muslims lied and they killed them. I don't know if there's any truth to that. I've heard that as well, but I don't know of its source. I don't know if there's any truth in that. Tafsir al-Qurtubi is in Arabic. There's actually, I just saw it today, subhanAllah, when I was doing some research. It's available in English, but only Surah Baqarah. So the introduction and Surah Al-Baqarah has been translated. If you just type in Tafsir al-Qurtubi, English, into Google, you'll find it. It was someone from Nigeria, subhanAllah. He translated it and he did an English version of Tafsir of Surah Al-Baqarah. I mean, it's one of the references with regards to tafsir. Tafsir al-Tabari, Tafsir al-Qurtubi, these kind of Tafsir ibn Kathir. Those are the books that a lot of the scholars they reference and they go back to with regards to tafsir. And Imam al-Qurtubi,